What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying these daily uploads and these longer 2-hour videos, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this one. If we could aim for 1,500 likes on these longer videos, that would be a good milestone to aim for. It all helps the channel to grow and the videos to do well, to ensure I can keep doing these for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, as my favorite part about doing these is reading your guys' thoughts. Without further ado, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours or so of true scary stories, and I hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you again at the end of the video. I was on Craigslist for the first time in probably 5 years. I'd forgotten about the site, never having any need or use for it, and never really hearing about it anymore either. Due to my moving situation though, I needed to get rid of a bunch of random things. I initially called a junk removal company, hoping they would just take away everything. Their estimate was over $400 just for getting rid of a couple of things, so that's when I went to Craigslist instead and put up a listing for a bunch of free stuff. I had pictures of all the things I was giving away. Maybe I just didn't know how it worked nowadays, but I thought I'd get a lot of responses from people wanting to nab up this free stuff before it was too late. However, I barely got any. The ones that did respond to the listing ended up ghosting me after just a couple of texts. About a week after initially making the listing, a man who introduced himself as KJ reached out. He said he wanted to pick up my couch and was good to do so on any day really. I thought this was just going to be the same as all the others that reached out to me, so I really didn't put much effort into getting this man to actually come pick it up. I let him know that I work between 9 to 5, so if he wanted to pick it up, just let me know. Again, I didn't think he'd actually come. Sure enough though, in the morning before work the next day, he sent me a text saying he'd like to swing by that very same night. I told him that was great, and as I left for work that night, I sent him my address. The drive home was only 20-ish minutes, but I hoped he'd come sooner rather than later. I didn't want to waste my whole night waiting on them to arrive, even more so if they didn't end up showing at all. When I pulled up into my driveway after work though, a car was already parked on the curb right next to my house, and nobody was in it either. It was the only car parked on the whole street, so it seemed rather clear they were at my house. Thinking it was KJ, I quickly got out and ran up to my front door, but he wasn't there. It was in the back of my mind that this could just be a crazy coincidence, and the car was parking to go to someone else's house. I wasn't convinced though. I went inside and sent a text to KJ, asking what his ETA was. I then stood by the window and looked outside. After 10 minutes or so, I still hadn't gotten any response. I didn't see anyone outside either, so I calmed down and turned away from the window. I went to the kitchen to pour myself a drink, and just stood there when a small thud sounded from upstairs. Unaware of what it could be, I put my drink down and listened in. There were a few seconds of silence, then suddenly heavy footsteps were running down the stairs. I was so caught off guard I just stood where I was and stared down the hallway. A man appeared at the other end, running right to the front door. He swung it open and ran out. When I made it to the front, he'd already jumped into the car that was parked on the curb and was driving away in a real hurry. I was still stunned, trying to process what just happened. because it was all so sudden and quick. I got out my phone and called the police, then tried calling KJ. He didn't pick up, which meant to me it was definitely him who had broken in. When the police investigated, they found that KJ's phone wasn't registered to a name or address, so we were back to square one. Nothing ever did come of it, despite me trying multiple times to get the police back on the case. As far as I know, nothing was stolen, so maybe he didn't have enough time to do so, or maybe he had been waiting for me all along. Maybe that sound I heard was him accidentally giving himself away, so he took the chance to make a run for it. He didn't have the element of surprise on me anymore. Whatever really happened, though, all I can do is hope he never comes back again. This is an experience I had that frankly may have ruined my life. It was something so simple, too, and wasn't even my fault at all. It started one morning while I was waiting for my usual bus to arrive. I had recently started working for a well-known and respected company in my town, and I was quite proud of my new job. I was a young guy, aged 21, and was eager to carve out a career for myself. As I was waiting for the bus to arrive, a mother and her daughter walked up and stood close by. The girl was about 4 or 5 years old, and she was holding what looked to be a violin case of some sort to her chest. Looked like they were on their way to a lesson or something, I thought. I began to overhear their conversation. "I've told you, Mommy can't go with you today. I'll be there to pick you up later, okay?" "No, I want you to go with me." The little girl appeared to be getting very upset. Her mom replied very sharply, "Yes, you can. When you hear the name of your station, get off and go to your lesson, okay? You just ring the bell and the driver will stop. You can do it. I believe in you." The mother was getting a little impatient at that point. I was feeling a little awkward, stood facing the road and waiting for the bus to arrive. I turned to take a look at them and noticed the little girl was on the verge of tears. Me turning to face them seemed to be a massive mistake on my part, because as soon as I looked their way, the mother locked eyes with me. "Oh, excuse me, are you going past Fujigala? Could you do me a favor and ring the bell and make sure she gets off the bus all right?" The bus had just pulled in at that point and was beginning to open its doors. I did what I thought would be the right thing to do. I said, "Yeah, of course I'll help." "Hey, sweetie, look, your big brother's here and he's gonna ride the bus with you. Isn't that great?" she said to her daughter. The girl stopped crying and grabbed my hand. I thought this would be my good deed for the day. I mean, who would deny a simple request to help out a little girl? I thought everything would be fine, but you know as well as I do that I wouldn't be sharing my story if things turned out fine. We climbed the steps and got a seat. The little girl sat down next to me and chattered away endlessly. She told me all about her school and her friends and her likes and dislikes. I smiled and nodded and mastered little questions of my own. I had worse rides to work in the morning, let me tell you. It was a breath of fresh air, really. Eventually, we approached the station and I rang the bell to alert the bus driver. The girl looked a little sad. I could tell she really didn't want to be alone. This was the stop just before my regular stop, so I asked the little girl if she was really okay to get off here and go to class all by herself. Her bottom lip started wobbling and tears started coming out of the corner of her eyes. I felt really bad, so I decided to just get off the bus with her and walk her over. I remembered her mother said it was only a 5-minute walk away, so I would still get to work on time fine if I took her to her lesson. I didn't want to see the girl cry. I mean, what can I say? The little girl grabbed my hand and we left. She stopped her whining and crying and went back to telling me about all her favorite little kid things to do. About 3 minutes into our walk, we passed a police officer on a bicycle. He took a sharp glance at me at that moment, and I realized I might have looked a little suspicious. A young man in a suit holding the hand of a little girl? Plus, the fact I was 21 and she was 4 or 5, something about the math didn't add up to a bystander, I suppose. And that's why he took interest in us. She was pulling my hand, and I'm guessing I didn't look like I was an older sibling or her father. We really didn't look alike at all. He was riding in the opposite direction though, so I thought he was just going to leave us alone. He'd just take a look and keep going. But then I heard the screech of bicycle brakes behind me. I knew he'd turned around. I felt a tap on my shoulder, and he asked, "Can I have a quick word with you?" I guess you can figure out what that means when an officer asks to have a talk with you. It's never great. The little girl began to cry and wail again, as we were both asked to go with the officer back to his station. The little girl was really sobbing. She didn't want to miss her violin lesson. I guess she probably thought she was going to be in some real big trouble. We entered the station and were taken into a room at the back, the one they used for interrogations. I was so flustered that I was doing a bad job of explaining the situation to the officer. He took my laptop bag and clocked my company's name on it, then decided to contact them. I guess he didn't believe I was even an employee there. Must have thought it was an accessory I used to make the child trust me. It's so frustrating thinking back on it. I told the officer my story and the little girl did as well and agreed with everything I said. He just wasn't buying it. Ultimately, my innocence was proven by the violin teacher as she contacted the girl's mom that I'd met at the bus stop, and she confirmed my story. After I was released and I got to work, I was ordered to see the head of my department. I explained it all, and I went home that night feeling exhausted, having mixed feelings about the day. I felt embarrassed most of all. I went back to work the following morning, and over the course of a couple of days, rumors about me started being spread behind my back. At work, I became famous as the newbie who got busted in a kidnapping attempt. These employees which were spreading the rumors were saying that I was arrested on suspicion of abducting a young girl. Because I was new and some of the employees had been there for a long time, they felt some sort of resentment toward me. Every hour of the day, I had someone lob a joke at me about being a kidnapper. I began to resent the company I worked so hard to get into. They all started to leave nasty post-it notes on my computer at work or say whispered things behind my back where they thought I couldn't hear. When some of the members of senior staff said something and started mocking and criticizing me too, the junior members of staff just used that as even more of an opportunity by joining in. No one cared how it was affecting me. My confidence was shot, my self-esteem was on the floor, I hated it. You know what I hated the most, though? It was the way all the female employees looked at me like I was some sort of predator or something. They refused to make eye contact with me and kept their interactions with me as short as humanly possible. The looks they gave me made me feel like a real criminal. All the coworkers I had initially gotten along well with were now avoiding me like I was carrying some sort of disease or something. I was innocent and it had been proven, yet I was still being treated like an evil kidnapper. I tried to ride out the storm because I truly wanted a career at that company, but when all the bullying didn't stop for 5 months and continued to escalate even more, I decided enough was enough. No one cared that I quit, of course. They just made sure to insult me as much as they could before I clocked out, and a few even got physical with their bullying. I guess this is the part where I tell you my thoughts after the fact. I'm sure the mother I met that day is a decent person, but she had terrible judgment skills and made a bad decision. I don't think she should be asking strangers to take her daughter on a bus ride. I hope she realizes that it could have been a lot worse if I was in fact the type of person my coworkers were bullying and making me out to be. I also don't think a girl of her daughter's age should be riding the bus alone in the first place. I myself never rode the bus alone until I was 10, and I know most parents probably wouldn't be all that okay with it either. At the end of the day, it's the police's job to investigate suspicious people, so I don't really blame the officer for detaining me. I think he did a great job, actually. I want the streets to be safe. I wish that he didn't contact my company, though. As for my coworkers, I hate them. How they made me give up my career that I really wanted, and how they didn't care that I was innocent at all. They just continued to escalate and escalate, until I really was on the verge of considering suicide. Things went really off track that day. I'd like to think that I would help again, but I'm not so sure now. My faith in humanity has been shaken a little. This event occurred when I was 21 and studying abroad. I was based out of Italy, but I convinced my parents to let me backpack for a few weeks to other major destinations in Europe. To prep, I read a few books and articles about traveling safely alone, and even watched the Liam Neeson film Taken right before I left just for good measure. My travels took me to Paris. I had dinner near the Opera House. As I left the restaurant, I noticed a group of 6 men behind me, heading in the same direction. I wasn't overly concerned at first. This is Paris after all, and there are always a lot of people walking everywhere. I began to notice, though, that this group of 6 were following me less than 20 feet behind, and were taking all the same turns as me. They all spoke in an Eastern European accent, similar to my limited exposure to Russian. After around 10 minutes, they seemed to have become aware that I'd noticed them attempting to follow me. They tried to engage in conversation with catcalls and general questions as well, all spoken in English. I was beginning to get a bit nervous about their behavior, so I decided to pretend I had no idea what they were saying. Immediately, they switched to speaking in French, which I don't speak at all. After another 15 minutes or so of them following me through several city blocks, nowhere close to the bed and breakfast I was staying at, the men were now following 10 feet behind, ensuring they were all but impossible to ignore. I was beginning to panic. I decided to use the non-native language that I knew best, Italian, in addition to pretending I didn't speak French or English. I tried to stay calm. I began to speak to them in Italian, saying things such as, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Is there something I can help you with?" I'm a fair-skinned blonde with blue eyes. They could probably tell I was not Italian really, but after 15 minutes of following me and being stonewalled by a language they couldn't understand, they began to close in. They moved close enough to reach out and grab me. I was at a loss of what to do. I forged ahead, trying to feign confidence and hide my inner panic. If I had turned down an unpopulated street at any point during all of this, I have no doubt they would have tried to grab me. The sun was already beginning to set, and I was nowhere near my intended destination anymore. Asking someone for help would shatter my facade of being Italian. I didn't know the city well enough to find the police station either. I was running out of options, and if I ran myself, at least one of the 6 would likely be able to catch me. I began walking up and down the same major street, with restaurants and tourists everywhere. I didn't want to leave this area. I was hoping this obvious repetition, combined with the large group following me, might catch the attention of someone that could help me out. After an hour of being tailed, they abruptly stopped following me and began to walk down another street. Maybe they decided I was too much trouble, or perhaps they were now hiding at different intervals and possible paths I might try to take to lose them. Shaking with anxiety and tension, I walked a nonsensical route back to my room, ducking down various alleys and streets. It took me 45 minutes to make it there. Once I entered, I began sobbing at the front desk, explaining to the clerk what had been happening. He locked the front doors and carried my bags to a room within earshot of the front desk, but out of view of the front door. My advice is that if you're ever traveling alone, you must always be vigilant and aware of your surroundings. Listen to your instincts, and assume a natural suspicion of anyone who's acting suspiciously. No matter what, though, try to stay calm and keep a level head. Think of your next move. Most importantly, don't let anyone follow you to where you're staying for the night. As all of you know, life can be a real struggle sometimes. Making ends meet isn't always easy, as just getting a job can be difficult. Several years back, I couldn't find a job at all. It was just rejection after rejection after rejection, and at the time, nobody was really hiring either. The few places that were ultra competitive. I was barely making over minimum wage as a deli employee at a grocery store. I remember one night I was looking online for ways to make extra money. I ended up stumbling upon Craigslist. I'd heard of Craigslist before, but never really explored it for myself. I found an ad on Craigslist for a freelance job, where I would be what's called a secret shopper. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a secret shopper is, it's basically an anonymous customer who comes into a store and asks the employees a series of questions. The employee is then graded on a certain criteria. For example, do they make eye contact, do they greet you, give suggestions, offer to escort the customer, etc. It seems simple, but a lot of companies, specifically the store I work for, will reprimand the employees for a bad secret shopper score, and even fire them if they get more than one bad score. Since I had experience in the store and knew exactly what they were looking for, I thought this would be an easy way to make some money on the side. The first store I visited was a local chain of grocery stores in my hometown. Oddly enough, it was the exact same company I worked for, but not the same store though. I started making my rounds and noticed a man in his 20s stalking the shelves. He looked at me and immediately put his head back down. He didn't greet me, so that's points off right away. I had to greet him and ask him where the canned tuna was. He never looked at me, just sort of angrily whispered, "Aisle 2, halfway down." Again, this guy lost more points, not only for not making eye contact or offering where to show me it, but also for being extremely angry. Just for the record, I know how ridiculous all this is, but these stupid companies take this junk seriously. They don't care if you're waiting on another customer or what the excuse is. If you get a bad score, you're just screwed. I was trying to pause and give the guy a chance to redeem himself by telling me to have a good day or something, but he never did. Eventually, I had to initiate the parting remark. That's when he finally looked up and said, "Yeah, you too." I saw his name tag and wrote it down. His name was Patrick. I smiled and walked away, but I noticed Patrick was keeping his eye on me. I could feel him staring at me as I walked away. I started to figure that maybe he was on to me, that I was a secret shopper and was going to ask a few more employees questions. I started to feel uncomfortable every time I looked up. I could see him at the end of every aisle. It almost seemed like he was following me. I wasn't sure what the end game was for this guy, but I didn't want to find out. I cashed out and the cashier passed her secret shopper's test with flying colors. After I cashed out, I briskly made my way to my car. I just wanted to get out of the store so badly and be done with this. Once I was in the car, I started writing down the full report before I drove off. I wanted to get all the information down while it was still fresh in my mind. While I was writing, though, I looked up and saw my buddy from the aisle intensely walking through the parking lot. Patrick. I ducked down a little bit, but thankfully it didn't appear he had noticed me yet. He just kept walking until he got to his car, which was a dark 4-door sedan of some kind. He sped off, and I waited a few minutes before I departed as well. I don't know why, but this guy gave me the real creeps. I just kept thinking to myself, why did he follow me all around the store like that? If he really was, but it truly did feel like he was following me. Something so strange about his behavior. I tried telling myself that I was just overthinking, but something about him definitely gave me weird vibes. I went home and emailed my supervisor the report, and life went on. It only took a day or two for me to completely forget about that interaction. A few nights after I'd turned in the report, I was having a late-night dinner with my boyfriend. We were hanging out, enjoying each other's company. when the relaxing evening was interrupted by a loud and constant banging on the front door. It wasn't just an aggressive knock either. It was the sound of someone throwing their entire body weight at the door. You have no idea how horrifying it is to hear a knock at the door at that hour, let alone someone trying to break it down. We looked out the window to see what was going on, and I was at a loss for words. It was that Patrick guy from the grocery store. He looked horrible. His eyes looked like they were sunken in, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days now. I called out telling him to leave right now, and I was calling the police, but he didn't respond. He just kept slamming against the door, demanding I let him enter our home. He kept saying that I ruined his life and that I needed to pay right now. He was going to give me an eye for an eye. I didn't even want to think about what he meant by that. While this interaction was happening, my boyfriend called the police. They must have been in the area because the first squad car showed up in less than 2 minutes. It's a good thing, too, because it didn't look like my door was going to hold much longer. Patrick was really throwing himself all into attacking it. The whole site was nuts. A cop tackled Patrick right on my front steps and handcuffed him. While they were apprehending him, they ended up finding a knife concealed in his waistband, which for me was the most terrifying information about this entire ordeal. I still can't stop thinking about what he intended to do to me with that knife if he had broken down the door. After he was arrested, I did get some closure on this whole nightmare. It turns out it was a situation of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Apparently, Patrick was at his wit's end, and my visit to the store that day was what forced him to fall off the cliff completely. He was struggling to pay bills, and from what I was told, his girlfriend had just broken up with him the day of that secret shopping event. When I approached him in the store that day, he was minutes away from the end of his shift and was mentally completely done at that point. I get it, we've all been there to a degree. I happened to catch him on a bad day. Turns out he ended up losing his job because he had failed another secret shopper's report. The part I can't figure out, though, is I have no idea how he found out where I lived. I don't think he followed me that day after the store, but there's no other way he would have known. I stayed at my boyfriend's house after that night, and I rarely stayed at my old house alone after. I don't know what happened to the guy, but I genuinely hope he figured it out. And more importantly, I hope these stores get rid of this secret shopper program, because it's just horrible and asking for something bad to happen. My name is Petra. I'm from the Netherlands. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were all together drinking coffee on the second floor when all of a sudden we heard a loud bang. We thought a client must have fallen over or something. We decided I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Then maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague was walking down the stairs, I happened to look at the monitor, which was on the second floor. I saw that someone was in the department on the ground floor. He was inside a closed one you could walk in, but you needed a code to get out. We watched for a while. The guy was stuck, and it seemed he couldn't get out on his own. We decided to go into a room on the second floor of one of our clients. You needed a special key to get into this room, so we thought it would be more safe. We explained to her what was going on, and she was perfectly capable of understanding the situation. Of course, we called 112 as well. They told me they would send someone out right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town, not too far away from us. I looked outside and saw the guy was climbing out of a window. I called back, and they asked if something had changed. The police had finally arrived, and we did a walk with them throughout the whole building. The guy had broken the door in the kitchen. The stuff he'd used to break it was lying there on the ground. The police couldn't really do much, though. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we found out the guy had been hiding around the building for 2 hours before he went in, and that the guy had also walked all over the ground floor looking everywhere while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day, I had one more night shift, and though I didn't have that much to fear, it still felt pretty scary. I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs with me this time. They said they were okay with that, so I brought them with me. The next night, nothing really happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course, I let them outside every now and then to do their thing. A couple of nights later, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? The guy came back. It turns out they robbed the safe. I'd always wondered why the guy was just looking around, but it turns out they had planned to come back and rob the safe the next night. I'm guessing my 2 dogs scared them off, and they decided to try again a few days later. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either, if I didn't know them. After that, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me and my dogs, because they felt much safer. I'm going to share an experience where I was almost abducted. It happened when I was in the 4th grade. My hometown is really rural, and to get to school, I needed to walk through this long, dark tunnel. It was about 30 meters long. I gotta tell you, that tunnel was so creepy. The sign at the entrance was all rusted and old, and the lighting in the tunnel was so dim that you could barely see where you were going. On top of that, I didn't really have any classmates who lived near me, so I would always have to brave it alone. It really sucked. It wasn't too bad in the mornings, but on those dark autumn and winter nights, it was very unnerving. When I was in the tunnel, I would try to talk to myself or sing out loud, so I wouldn't be as scared. I often walked very quickly, and sometimes even sprinted through there. It must have sounded very weird for anyone passing by, or anyone with their car windows open, listening to me singing. One afternoon, I think it was about 5 p.m. or so, I left school later than usual that day. I remember it was late in autumn. It was already getting dark out as I left the school's gates, and all I could think about was how I had to go back through that tunnel and how it was making me anxious. I wanted to ask the teacher to call my mom to come and get me, but my pride wouldn't let me do it. I knew I would just have to face up to my fears and walk home alone. The usual roads I walked down felt all the more eerie because it was so dark out. I decided to sing one of my favorite songs out loud in a stupid voice to break the tension. It worked for a bit, but I started to get embarrassed. What the hell was I even doing? I quit singing when I'd arrived just outside of the tunnel. It seemed darker than ever, and the wind echoed ominously through it. I thought I could hear the distant sounds of an animal of some sort. I really didn't want to go into that darkness, but I had to get home. If I wasn't home soon, I'd be in some real trouble. I could literally hear my mother telling me I would not be allowed to walk home again if I couldn't face up to going through this tunnel when it was dark. Still, I was stuck there like a statue in place, on the edge of a dilemma. I was just staring into the dark tunnel's mouth, thinking, I have to. I must have stood there like that for 2 minutes or so before I came back to my senses. That was when I heard a car approaching. Eventually, I saw the headlights of that car illuminate the tunnel ahead of me. I shuffled off to the side to allow the car enough room to pass by. I expected it to go right through, but it didn't. The car pulled up alongside me, and I heard a voice call out to me, "Hey, are you okay?" I turned around instinctively, and to be honest, I was a little surprised. I wasn't usually spoken to when I was on the way home. I faced the owner of the car to see a woman winding down the passenger side window. Although I was unable to see her face very well with the lighting, I could tell it was a woman just by the voice. "Hey, you need a ride, kid? I can take you home if you want." At school, we were always told we should never get into strangers' cars. I wanted to go home, though. I didn't want to go through the dark tunnel by myself. I figured that I'd just let her give me a ride to the other side, and then I could get out and everything would be fine, wouldn't it? I was convincing myself it was a good idea. Without even giving it much thought, I replied to the woman, "Yes, please." Looking back on it now, she didn't know where I lived. She didn't know me. Therefore, it seemed odd of her to offer a ride without knowing where she was even supposed to be going. Had I had the presence of mind to think about it logically and calmly, I might have noticed the signs that something was strange, but logical thought wasn't an option that day. Stupidly, I got into that stranger's car. When I got in, it was actually quite warm. What struck me first was the smell. There was this horrible, unusual smell in there. The woman pulled away and we entered the tunnel. I spoke to her in a meek voice and said that to drop me off on the other side would be perfectly fine, as I lived in one of the houses close by. The woman didn't react though. She didn't say a single word. She just remained completely silent. Initially, I thought it was awkward, but then an unsettling feeling began to creep into my mind. The abnormality of my situation began to dawn on me, and I realized this could be dangerous. With that realization, cold sweat began to amass all over my body. "I think I'd like to get off here." This got a response from the strange woman. She looked over toward me, smirked, and laughed at me. The car then sped up rapidly. Before, we had been traveling about the speed of a bicycle, but now the speed was increasing. A very serious and adult thought came to the forefront of my mind. If I don't get out of this car, something bad is going to happen to me. I felt that as a deep instinct. Even though I was terrified, I forced my body to respond to my will. I've never felt fear like that before or since. I scrambled to open the door. I had no idea how fast the car was going now, but if I had to guess now that I'm older, I would say about 50 kilometers per hour, which is just over 30 miles per hour. Without hesitation, I opened the door and threw myself out of it. I felt pretty intense and severe pain all over my body. I clattered and rolled along the asphalt. I heard the woman scream something as she sped off. I raised my head to make sure she was gone, and I witnessed her smashing into the guardrail. I hope she went over it and fell. We live in a mountainous area, and going through a guardrail could likely lead to going over the edge of the mountain. It could be fatal, and based on what the woman had in store for me that night, I really hope it was. I still do. By the way, that's the last thing I remember about that day. I woke up in a hospital bed. I was found later by a passing car, injured and unconscious inside the tunnel. He'd actually thought I'd been in a hit-and-run accident, so he called the emergency services to report it. I had broken bones and was covered in cuts and bruises. I got a lot of time off from school, but I was in a hospital and hospitals are boring. My mom went insane and insisted I could never walk through that tunnel that far to school and back ever again. We even moved homes while I was in the hospital. She really put her foot down. That was the last time I ever walked through that tunnel, and to be honest, I'm a bit glad. I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio, and outside of town there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin redneck part of town. It's not even in the same county, but it's part of the general area of my city. In the woods, there's a legend of Hell's Church. Supposedly an old church that burned down, where Satanists would perform rituals. Or a Satanist church that burned down during a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Church stories in Ohio, in various different places. This was just the one closest to us. A number of my friends decided they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places around where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought this was just stupid bullshit, we thought it would be amusing to go out and scare ourselves a little. Plus, most of us had cars and driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying a new burst of freedom. Now, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat about most stuff like this. I was the most tomboyish girl of the group, and kind of just wanted to hang out with the guys though. Plus, there were some other girls in the group that were tagging along. I didn't want to be the only one to look like a loser or a little punk. One day in November, we decided we were going to go out one night and try and find this Hell's Church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we had to leave. Much to the group's disappointment and to my relief, we did not locate the church, which supposedly had rotted down to a chimney at this point. We took 2 cars out there this time, going past the more populated parts of our city and back toward the forested area. I can't honestly tell you how we got there, but I do know it was off of a state highway and then down an abandoned access road, past some old warehouses, and finally down a dirt road. Once you got down the dirt road, there was a kind of thicker part of the road. We parked there off the shoulder. We did this because the road eventually thinned out and became impossible to drive down. Also, someone clearly owned this land, as there were no trespassing signs posted. I'm sure a ton of kids go back there, so it didn't seem odd that somebody wanted this place blocked off at the time. I really didn't think too much into it. They got out of their cars and began walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time to check out some barns in the clearings where we thought the chimney might be. Some of them were filled with weird spray-painted symbols and other shit, but that's not really what bothered us. There was also other stuff like dead owls that looked like they had been eviscerated, though they appeared to be dried out and decomposed for some time. There were other bits that looked like they may have come from animals as well. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed that this could have been the work of some teenagers attempting to mimic some kind of satanic ritual, or perhaps some of these animals had simply gotten trapped in barns and died there, only to be picked apart by other animals later on. The guys were now desperately trying to find this stupid chimney. They kept taking off through the trees and the clearings. Myself and the other 2 girls who were there just sort of hung back, getting a little more nervous and irritated with the guys, who continued to come up empty-handed. As we kept going, we found a bike in the tree line, like a bike that a 12-year-old would ride. It was out of place and a bit creepy, but whatever, it probably belonged to someone who owned the property. We decided we were just gonna go a bit further, and soon we found another bicycle. This one was a bit older, a little rusted. It looked too small to be an adult-sized bike. We didn't want to talk too much about the other bike that we saw. We just kept shrugging it off, ignoring the possible implications. That was until one of the guys decided to say, "You think those kids got murdered by the same freaks that were cutting up those animals back there?" It was entirely possible, I supposed, but nobody was really having any of it. By this point, we'd been out there for almost 2 hours, and it was really getting late. Plus, I think we were all a bit more creeped out than we wanted to admit. We decided to head back to the cars, and I instantly felt relieved. Very happy to finally be heading back home. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we saw a road that went straight up to a hill, through the trees at the start of it. There was a big metal gate that had a road closed sign on it as well. We had seen this before, but it never occurred to us that we should try to go up that road. After a small debate by the gate, we eventually decided to go for it. I really didn't want to, but apparently I was on the losing side. There wasn't a lot I could do about it. We climbed over the gate and started up the hill, where an old cracked pavement road crumbled under our feet. Along with the poor road conditions, there were a bunch of trees that had fallen onto the path, blocking off the road from any cars passing through. Some of us started to seriously question if we should even be doing this, arguing that someone obviously wanted to keep people out of there. We just got made fun of, though, for being afraid, and kept going. I couldn't see where the road ended. We had flashlights, but they weren't doing us much good. The trees made it very hard to see. All of a sudden, the road ended, though, and the trees opened up off an incline to a flat field. What a sight it was. A flat field with tall grass on either side, probably 2 to 3 feet high. The path that we were on extended into the field and eventually led to a cul-de-sac of 3 buildings. 2 of them looked like they were farmhouses, and the other looked like an old barn. All 3 of the buildings were made of wood and looked like they had been weathered and stripped by time. As soon as I saw those 3 buildings, I was done. I wanted nothing more than to get out of there, as did the other 2 girls in the group, and one other guy who decided he'd had enough himself. The 4 of us stayed behind, while the other 3 guys went to check out the buildings. While we didn't want to be out in this field in the open, we decided we couldn't just leave them. At this point, we turned off our flashlights while the 4 of us waited. We started complaining about how stupid our friends were, making small talk. None of us said it, but we were all looking to the grass every now and again, worried that something was going to jump out at us. The setting was just so creepy. It felt like our friends were gone forever almost. We did see them get to the first building and go inside. Then we saw the flicker of flashlights in the windows. I just remember feeling so tense, like I was watching a horror film in real life. Maybe after about 10 minutes, we saw one of our friends coming towards us and lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots went inside?" I asked. He just looked at us and said yeah. It was full of bikes just like the ones we'd seen, chained to the walls. We didn't believe him and kept waiting for him to say it was just a joke, but he insisted. Eventually, the other 2 came back and reiterated that there was just a bunch of bikes in those buildings, most of them being smaller and for children. They all looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. They weren't the kind of guys to pull a prank this elaborate. We all agreed to get out of there. We started going down the hill as fast as we could. All of a sudden, about halfway down, we saw a pair of headlights about where our cars were parked. They slowly passed by, and we knew they were looking for us. We were so far off the beaten path there was no other reason for them to be there. We figured one of 2 things. They were either cops and we were going to get busted for trespassing, or they were the people who owned this land. So either A, arrested, or B, murdered. We knew the road didn't go on for much longer from where the cars were parked, so they would be turning around soon. Since our cars were parked right there, they would probably be waiting for us. We were all whispering about this as we picked up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we could. I'm not a good runner myself, but I was hauling ass to keep up with the rest of the group, basically hurtling over all the fallen trees. Once we got down the hill, we didn't see the headlights anymore, but we knew that they couldn't be far away. "Hurry up and get in the cars," one of our friends yelled. In typical horror film fashion, we were fumbling with the doors, too nervous to even think straight. As soon as the cars started up, we saw the headlights speeding down the road. A giant black truck came speeding towards us. The truck seemed larger than life, raised up off the ground. We put the pedal to the metal and peeled out of there. The truck was still following us, tailgating the car, almost as if they were trying to run us off the road. Everyone was screaming, looking back at the truck, fighting to get some distance away. Once we got back to the highway, we were switching lanes trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was easy for us to weave in and out of the other cars. The truck still pursued us all the same. Both of our sedans were in 2 different lanes, but we didn't want to get too far away from our friends. The passengers of both vehicles were texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took us 15 minutes to finally lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much or if they just gave up and turned around, but once we got to the big shopping center area, we ducked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We all sat in our cars for a bit, watching to make sure we didn't get snuck up on. It took us a while to settle down enough to head home. Everyone was pretty shaken up, even the guys who tried to act tough the entire time. During what was a pretty quiet car ride, exhaustion and lingering fear took over. We didn't talk about it again for a long time, and we never called the police either. Honestly, looking back as an adult, we probably should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall, but when I do, I have to ask myself, who chased us that night? Why were all those buildings abandoned? Who owned those bikes and where are they now? I started narrating stories on YouTube because after sending in every story I wrote to all the big names and a few lesser-known names, I got no response at all. No, thanks for sending your story, no, your story sucks, nothing. I won't mention who they are, but most of you probably know who I'm talking about. This went on for a while, and after months of frustration, I realized it just wasn't going to happen. I decided to narrate my own stories, create my YouTube channel, pick a name, and post them all myself. I mean, how hard could it really be? And so I did. My stories were pretty good, at least I thought so, and to my surprise, more than a few people actually liked them. After a while, some people started asking if I would narrate their stories. Wow, really? Okay, I thought. They would send them to me via email, which I'd given them, and I would narrate their stories on my channel. That really started the ball rolling. I remember I was talking to a coworker one day about reading these stories for fun, and they suggested I check out an app called Reddit and search scary stories and no sleep. They said they'd actually posted a few times on there themselves and thought it would be perfect for me. So I created an account and started to familiarize myself. I found all kinds of amazing stories. I contacted some authors through comments and personal messages, asking permission to read their stories. Most were cool with it. And although I did get a few rejections, I just kept on asking. I always asked for permission, and things were going pretty great. I was narrating amazing stories and people were liking them. I even earned enough karma on Reddit to start my own community. I decided to use it for people to send stories to, and people actually did. All the while, I still searched for other communities for stories to read. That was until I found one particular story. I should have known by their username that this likely wasn't a good idea. I'm not going to mention it specifically for the sake of anonymity. I remember it was around 1 a.m. or so and insomnia had set in. I was just sitting at my dining room table scrolling through Reddit when I found this particular story. It really blew me away. It had all the drama, suspense, emotion, everything. I contacted the author through a personal message, asking permission as per usual. For some reason, though, I signed on using my real name instead of my stage name on accident. Big mistake. I realized what I'd just done, but it was already too late. I'd already hit send anyway. Seconds went by before I received a reply. "Yes, I've been waiting for this," they said. Thinking they'd been waiting for someone to read one of their stories just like I was, I replied thank you and planned to just go on with my night. That is, until I received another personal message from the author. "Hi, my name is Susan. Wanna talk?" I figured, what the hell? I'm not doing anything else. What could it possibly hurt? I sent back a sure. After a 30-minute or so conversation, I found out that 1, the author was a female, and 2, we both really liked Stephen King. 3, we both liked horror movies, and 4, we both lived in the United States. Only a few states away from each other, in fact. I started getting pretty tired, so I let her know I'd be going to bed, and we ended the conversation both saying goodnight. I was lying in bed almost asleep when I got another message from her. "I'm glad to have someone like you to talk to. I really missed that." I shrugged it off and went to sleep. A couple of days went by and I came home from work. I found a note taped to my door. It said, "Hi, sorry, I missed you. Love, Susan." What love? I'd only talked to her for a half an hour. How did she even get my address? What did I just get myself into? I took the note off my door and quickly went inside, locking it and calling the police. I told them the whole story and they said there was nothing they could do until an actual crime was committed. Wow, how reassuring. I hung up and tried to just do my usual routine. Make coffee, get changed, drink coffee, so on and so forth. I couldn't get that note out of my head though. All of a sudden the doorbell rang. I froze and slowly walked to the window to see who it was. It was a woman, about 5.5 feet tall, tattered, dirty clothes and long stringy brown hair. It looked like she hadn't bathed in an entire month. Immediately, I knew this must be Susan. I had to end this quick right now before it turned ugly. And ugly it did turn. I opened the door just a crack and said, "Look, Susan, I don't know what you think is going on, but I just wanted to reach out for your story, that's it. I'm sorry if you thought there was something more, but there's not. Go home already." I shut the door and locked it, and went back into my house. She started screaming like a wild woman. She started pounding on the door, screaming "I love you" over and over. I immediately ran to the phone to call 911 again. A rock or a brick or something broke through the front window. I turned and saw that crazy woman climbing into my house over the broken glass. She even cut herself as she climbed in. Blood fell down the window and onto the floor. The dispatcher said, "911, what's your emergency?" I barely had any time to say anything before she charged at me and knocked me over the desk. She fell to the floor herself. She was kicking and screaming like a lunatic. I got up, phone still in hand, and smashed it against her temple as she was getting up. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head and the screaming stopped. I guess I'd knocked her unconscious. I heard sirens outside. I guess the 911 operator had heard all the commotion in the meantime. The cops came and took my statement. They made me stay outside where the paramedics tended to Susan, if that even was her real name at all. The cops put her into cuffs, and the paramedics took her to the ambulance. On her way out, she just looked at me and began laughing. They put her inside and left. The cops finished up, and I did the same. I was left with a broken door and a broken window. Blood was all over the place, my desk was broken, my phone was broken, all over a single story. I was done. I moved out that night. I left all my stuff behind and slept in my car until payday. I then rented a room off a coworker, and I never did narrate another story again. If any of my subscribers are reading this and wonder whatever happened to me, now you know why I stopped narrating stories on YouTube. About 4 years ago, I had just moved into my husband's apartment after we had started dating seriously. He worked a big boy 9-to-5 job, and I was a cook at a restaurant, so I worked and slept at odd hours. One afternoon, I was asleep in the back bedroom when I woke up and saw what I assumed to be my significant other standing at the foot of my bed. My husband is a real giant, and the size of the person in my room looked just about right. We have blackout curtains so I can sleep during the day, so it was nearly pitch black in the room. I grabbed my phone to check the time, because he definitely wasn't supposed to be home at that time of day. When I saw it was about 12 p.m., I asked the figure at the foot of my bed if he was okay, as I still thought this was my husband. The figure turned and walked out of my bedroom, and I heard the front door slam shut, so I fell back asleep. I woke up after a few hours, got out of bed to walk to the living room, when a shard of glass sliced my foot open. Upon hobbling over to the kitchen, I discovered that someone had smashed the glass of our sliding door and tracked glass and mud all over the apartment. Thankfully, we had just moved our electronics to the bedroom I'd been sleeping in, so nothing was stolen. We called the cops anyway, and they did their usual CSI-type stuff. And they told us they couldn't catch the guy. He was probably long gone, but we should definitely invest in some sort of security system, or at least get a dog. Because the man had stood in front of my bed for so long, His boots actually left imprints in the rug, not only at the foot of the bed, but by the side of the bed where I was sleeping. I choose to believe that he somehow knew we ran a server and wanted our computer stuff, but my husband thinks the guy must have been there for me specifically. We've since gotten a house with an alarm system, 2 adorable pit bulls that probably won't do shit to stop an intruder, and several guns for protection. Go America, I guess. This happened during the summer break of 2021. For some context, my name is Anita, and I'm a 28-year-old Haitian-American woman living in Miami, Florida. In April of 2021, me and my closest cousins named Janice and Julia decided to take a 2-week trip to Haiti to visit family members. Our first week there went well, with no incidents really. We were staying in a smaller town. We spent time with our family and enjoyed the beach, the beautiful scenery, and the great food. The next week is where things really started to go south. We started off the week by driving to the capital of Haiti. On the second day there, my cousins and I decided to run some errands in the afternoon. While we were out, we turned down a random street to buy some souvenirs from a street vendor. After we got out of the car, though, we saw a white Toyota Land Cruiser with blacked-out windows speeding down the street and coming towards us. All of us, including the street vendor, went into full panic mode and ran away. I looked behind me to see an assailant exiting the vehicle with an automatic weapon. He opened fire immediately, and bullets flew past us. We heard profanities being shouted in Creole. Thankfully, none of us were injured. We took refuge in a nearby alleyway where we were spotted by a local who understood what was going on. He was kind enough to allow us to hide out in his apartment until the gunman left the area. But the drama was far from over. We heard many gunshots from outside, and people screaming at each other as well. After what felt like 2 hours, we went to check outside. We saw dead bodies and blood all over the street. We got out of there as soon as possible. Luckily for us, our rental car had not been stolen. It may have seemed like the men were targeting us initially, but it's more than likely we'd accidentally stumbled into a turf war between rivaling gangs. We didn't even bother to call the police. The Haitian police are some of the most corrupt on the entire planet. Many of them are probably members of the gangs themselves. We went back home completely traumatized. For the rest of our stay, we didn't go out and counted down the days until we returned to Florida. Things have only gotten even worse in Haiti since then. There seems to be never-ending kidnappings, homicides, and street violence happening all the time. As much as it pains me to say this, I'll not be returning there anytime soon. A few years ago, I came to something of a sort of unfortunate realization. I was not great at cleaning. Now, don't get it twisted, I didn't live like a pig or anything. I changed my sheets regularly, didn't leave the dishes around, and generally kept my apartment clean and tidy. But then, as I learned, if you live in an apartment in the Northeast and try to skimp on heating bills in the winter, you're going to invite some very unwanted guests into your place. I'm not talking about rats or roaches here. I'm talking about mold. Don't worry, this isn't going to be some story about me talking about a mold outbreak or something. Although it is scary how fast it spread, and how gross and frightening it was to clean. No, this story is about how we all think we know the places we live in, right up until we realize that we really don't. Without boring you with any extraneous details further, there was a huge mold outbreak, and it took a whole day's worth of dabbing Clorox on the walls to get rid of it all. Like a lot of stuff like that though, it's not good to just bleach what you can see. You have to find the source of where it's coming from. In every room in my apartment, of which there were 4 if you count the hallway, I had to bleach all the mold I could see and find the source of the infection, which was sometimes hidden out of sight. I did the TV room and the kitchen and worked my way down the hallway into the bathroom. Finally, I started working on my bedroom. As I was dabbing away at this huge mold infestation, I slowly figured that the mold was coming from my boiler closet. That made sense. It was a damp, dark, and warm place. Of course it's going to grow there. I don't think I'd opened this closet in an entire year, which I know, lucky me, right? Never having any hot water problems or anything. Well, not so lucky after all, actually, because I opened up that closet door and saw the mother lode staring me right in the face. The whole outbreak must have come from this one room. I got to work wiping the whole place down. Once I thought I was done, I grabbed a flashlight and leaned into the closet. I started looking around for any patches I might have missed, perhaps up near the closet ceiling or something. That was when I noticed this little wooden shelf, and on that little shelf was something made of fur or felt or something. It was natural enough for the mold to take a real liking to it. Knowing I'd have another outbreak if I just left it there, I grabbed what turned out to be a little felt-lined box of some sort. I carried it off into the kitchen to be cleaned as well. Obviously, I was curious as to what was inside. Mostly because this thing must have been sitting in my apartment for coming up on 3 years without me even knowing it was there. It also dawned on me that whatever was inside must be precious enough to store in a fancy fur box. That's in addition to hiding it away somewhere. Therefore, there was a good chance that there might be, I don't know, some coins or something in there, maybe even some precious stones of some sort. After wiping away the mold, grime, and dust that had accumulated over the many years, I unclasped the little brass lock and opened up the box inside. There was nothing but a small envelope and an old audio cassette tape. The tape didn't have any labels on it, so there was no telling what it might contain. The same applied to the envelope as well. No address, no writing at all, nothing. I didn't have any means of playing the tape. My laptop doesn't even have a disc tray anymore. I opened up the envelope as well to find a bunch of photographs inside. The first 2 or 3 photos were just of some dirty old basement, so I started flipping through them faster until I saw one of a girl. Right away, I knew something was off here because she didn't seem to be posing in any of the pictures. It looked like whoever had taken them had just shoved a camera up in her face, flashed, and then just snapped away. At first she looked annoyed, then started to look scared. It was the scared expression that really caught my attention. I recall staring at that one photo for a little too long. Not because it was nice to look at or anything, but because it was so strange, and I was dreading whatever I would discover next. I started flipping through the photos more, real fast, before shoving them back into the envelope and closing it up. What I saw didn't seem real. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but there was no way in hell I was going to look at them all over again to check. I'd seen pictures of the basement again, with the girl in it, this time tied up with no clothes on. The way she looked, that look on her face in those photos, no actor or actress in the world can capture that true terror. It was etched all over that poor girl's face. I had no idea what to do with this at first. I just knew I had to get them out of my apartment. I didn't even want to touch them. I was panicking about having my fingerprints all over them now. Even though they looked like they were taken at a time when I wasn't even alive yet. I guess I was so shocked by what I'd seen, I wasn't thinking straight. I just kinda went full forensic files. I didn't want to go anywhere near them for fear of contaminating the evidence or something. I then called the police and told them the whole story. I was told I'd get a call from the relevant party either later that day or the following morning. They told me not to worry about all that contamination stuff, as they could simply take a sample of my DNA and fingerprints to eliminate me as a suspect. Essentially, they just said I didn't have to go treating my boiler room, closet, or kitchen like a crime scene. I could just put it to the side in a Ziploc bag or whatever, and someone would be by to take a look the next day. At one point the day after, some detective guy stopped by my apartment after giving me a call ahead of time. He put on some of those plastic gloves and started taking a look through those photographs. The thing I still find incredibly creepy about those few moments was how he was able to look through each and every photograph and really take it all in an instant, not even batting an eye. It really made me wonder what other stuff he'd seen in his lifetime to make him so calm and collected like that. Having determined the pictures were legitimate, the cops started bagging up the evidence. He asked me if I'd listened to what was on the tape, and when I told him no, he told me it was probably for the best. Before he left, he asked me to take a look in my closet real quick, as in the place that I'd found the box in the first place. I told him sure. After making sure there was nothing else hidden away, he gave me his contact details and told me to give him a call if I found anything else. I never did find anything else, nor did I ever hear back from that detective. Part of me wanted to reach out at one point just to see how the investigation was going, but I also didn't really want to. There was only one thing I really needed to know, and that was something I could find out for myself. I went down into the basement of my apartment building just to take a look around. I don't think words can sum up how relieved I was when nothing matched the scenery I saw in those photographs. I know there's really nothing I could have done about what happened to that poor girl in those photos. It happened so long ago, but it did help me sleep a little better, knowing it hadn't happened underneath the place I laid my head at to sleep at night. I'm typing this now at 1 in the morning because I can't sleep. Let me give you a little bit of context, I guess. I live off the side of the main road in a small town in Kentucky. In an even smaller community, a lot of not-so-friendly-looking people walk up and down the road at all hours around me. On the property is me, my father-in-law, my brother-in-law, and his family. My husband and his brother drive trucks for a living, and they're over the road during the week, so we're pretty much alone. For that reason, I won't be using any names. At around 9 p.m., I was sitting in my bedroom going over a creepypasta that I was going to tell on my live scary story show I had started on Facebook. Little did I know that I would be living out my own true scary story tonight. Out of nowhere, my daughter had started freaking out, saying they'd heard knocking outside. I assumed it was my sister-in-law coming to inform me that my husband's outside dog had gotten loose, which tended to happen on nights such as this. When I got to the door, though, I was surprised to see that no one was there. It was a very windy night, so I assumed the wind had blown something against the house and made that sound that scared them. I returned to my room and got back to work on the story. I left my door open. Then I heard it as well. I was trying to convince myself that I was just hearing things that were not there. Just to be safe, though, I went to have a look again. No one was there, I told myself. If someone was there, the security camera would have surely alerted my phone of any motion. I gave up on my story for a brief moment and sat in the living room to see if I'd hear the knocking again. I did. It wasn't a light tapping, though, like one would hear if the wind was blowing or the house was settling. It was actually 5 knocks. I ran to the door, and nobody was there. I began to panic because it sounded as if it was coming from the side of the house, out of range of the cameras. I figured, just to be safe, I would call my dad to come take a look around. When I called my dad's phone, my mom answered, and the conversation went about as follows. "Hey, Mom, I think someone's outside my house knocking on it." "Honey, your daughter thinks someone's inside her house." "Okay, he's putting on his shoes. He'll be there in a minute." While I waited for my dad to make the 2-minute drive over, I called my husband as well to keep me calm while I waited. I tried to play it off like I wasn't in full-on panic mode in front of my daughter. I then went ahead and sent my daughter to my room and told her to lock the door, since her door didn't have a lock on it. My husband was telling me I was probably just overreacting, which I fully believed as well, but I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. One thing about my dad: he may be little, but he can be very intimidating, and if his loved ones are in danger, you better run for your life, because he can really turn into a mixture of the Hulk and the Flash in no time at all. My dad got there and walked all around my house, up and down my yard, and verified that no one seemed to be there. I explained what we were hearing, and he said the same thing my husband had said. We were likely just scaring ourselves. Shortly after my dad left, though, I began to hear gunshots outside my house. I grabbed my husband's shotgun and ran to the door in a panic. I started turning lights off and looked outside. I didn't see any signs of anyone. My husband then called me. He said to grab his gun and get our daughter into our room, then lock the bedroom door. Yeah, my daughter had heard the shots too, so there was no calmly at all. I asked what was going on. He explained that my sister-in-law had called her husband, complaining of the very same knocking at her house. My husband called his father to let him know, and he complained of the same knocking at his bathroom window. He'd gone outside to make a point to whoever was messing with us and began to shoot off some rounds to nicely say, "I'm armed and not afraid to use it." What really put this all together into reality for me was the fact that I hadn't spoken to either my father-in-law or sister-in-law to tell them about the suspicious knocking. I'd assumed it was just in my imagination, so how would they have even known if it didn't actually happen to them as well? I asked if I could go outside and shoot off some rounds myself just to make a point of my own. He advised me not to do that, because this person may have very well been trying to lure someone outside. That happened just a short time ago. I'm typing out the story at 1 a.m. sitting next to my husband's gun on the couch, while my child is finally in bed sleeping. I really advise everyone out there to always keep your doors and windows locked at all times, and to trust your gut feeling if something doesn't feel right. If it doesn't, it's probably for a reason. Stay safe out there. This happened when I was 16. At the time, it was October, and I would often go for walks at night and listen to music just to decompress and collect my thoughts. Once in a while, I would encounter something strange, but for the most part, I never had any particularly bad encounters with anyone. That is, until this one night. It was about 12:30 a.m., and looking back at it now, it was pretty stupid to walk alone that late at night, especially as a young girl. Like I said though, nothing bad had ever really happened to me before. I remember I was walking to the park in my neighborhood to swing on the swings, because that park had a very pretty view of the city. However, as I was walking there, I got a very bad feeling. I just had this sensation that something terrible was going to happen to me. I should have just turned around right then, but I figured I was just having some anxiety. I remember walking up the street across the main road to get to the park across the street when I saw this turquoise-looking car sitting idly with its headlights on. Though it was a main road, it was late at night now, so there were no other cars out. When the car noticed me, it immediately started driving toward me. I knew something was up here, so I started walking up the main road faster. The car started slowly driving behind me. When the car didn't just drive past me, I suspected they were going to keep following me, and I was right. I kept walking, and the car crept along slowly behind me for multiple blocks. I remember getting very scared, so I got my phone out and got it on. I kept looking back and trying to make it obvious that I was aware they were following me. I tried to call my mom as well, but she didn't answer. After a few minutes of being terrified and knowing the car was not going to stop following me, I called 911 just to be safe. I put the operator on speakerphone and told her about the whole situation. I looked back and noticed the car had now slowed down even further, falling about a half a block behind me. It was hard to see what exactly was going on, but I realized the car was in fact still following me, just in a much slower speed and from a farther distance to make it look like they had stopped doing so. This creeped me out even more. I thought the car was trying to trick me now. Soon after the operator had asked my location, I saw the car immediately make a U-turn and head back down the street. I told the operator that I didn't need them to send anyone out because the car had now turned around. I still had the feeling that the car might come back though, so I quickly ducked into a nearby alley I had found and walked all the way down it. I looked over my shoulder every few seconds just to make sure that no one was following me. I hid for about 20 minutes behind the dumpster on the side of the alley. I made sure I was out of view of anyone passing by. After about 20 minutes, I decided to get up and leave. As I was leaving the alley, though, I heard a voice yell out to me, "Hey!" I ran out of the alley, only to find that at the end, parked in front and blocking the entrance of the alleyway, was the same car that had been following me. The car was sitting there with its lights still on. I decided it definitely wasn't worth risking going back up the alley, so I decided to just run right past the car. I held my phone out and faked a phone call, saying I'd be home shortly. I was about 30 seconds away from my house, so I just booked it the whole rest of the way. I didn't even check behind me. I just ran until I got home safely. I was left with a lot of questions, though. I thought I was safe waiting in that alley. I didn't think anyone had seen me duck in to hide, but I guess I was wrong. The whole experience has really shaken me up. I hope by submitting this story, it'll encourage more people to be more careful about walking alone at night, as well as to be wary of your surroundings. I really thought I was safe by myself, but I was completely wrong. This story took place in 2020 when I was 18 years old. I lived in a relatively safe neighborhood, but my country does have a high crime rate in general. Take that with a pinch of salt as a result. My dad passed away earlier in the year, and I had no siblings, so my mom and I were now living alone. The lockdowns were still in place, but as certain restrictions were lifted, people started to return to work. Between my house and the train tracks was a stretch of empty field. It became a sort of safe, quiet space for me to escape to whenever I needed to get out of the house. I would normally sit there about once a day, smoking a cigarette or two. Sometimes I'd even prepare a little picnic for myself. My home situation was very complicated to say the least. Due to the lockdowns, I really had nowhere else to go. On this particular day, I went there for a few minutes to smoke as always. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I noticed a young man walking along the train tracks on the other side of the field. He was barefoot and wearing dirty, worn-out clothes. He noticed me and made a hand gesture, suggesting that he was asking for a smoke. I should have just left, but as a teenager, I found it difficult to say no to people. I walked across the field and handed him a smoke. He took it from me, and I immediately felt uneasy from the way he was looking at me. "Hey, don't you live in that house over there?" he asked, and pointed exactly at my home. I avoided answering the question, and at that point I realized I needed to leave. I had left from my front gate that day, so for him to know where I lived, he must have watched me leave from the back gate before. I told him I needed to get going, and he insisted on giving me a hug to say thank you. I declined several times. At that point, I turned around and started walking away quickly. I didn't get very far, though, before he caught up to me and wrapped his arm around my waist. I started to panic, not knowing what to do. All I could think of was that I needed to get away from this guy. As I tried to start running, he grabbed me from behind and started dragging me toward the row of houses from where the view of the road was completely blocked off. The fences were high too, so no one could see the field from their backyards. We would be completely isolated. I was kicking and struggling, desperate to get out of this guy's grasp. He ended up throwing me on the ground, and with him on top of me still holding on, in a split second my life flashed before my eyes. I had that feeling that something terrible was about to happen come over me. I couldn't escape from him. He was too strong. My arms were trapped by his, and he was holding me down so I couldn't kick him. The only thing I could do now was scream for help. I started screaming, and all of a sudden I was free. I could move. He'd let me go and jumped off of me. He began running away. My heart was still pounding. I was shaking and shocked from what just happened. He disappeared into the industrial area on the other side of the train tracks. I immediately ran toward the road. As I reached it, I realized it was empty. There were no cars parked in my neighbors' driveways. No one had heard me screaming. Had he realized that, the day would have ended far worse for me. He knew where I lived, though, and I was terrified of him returning for months. I had panic attacks and nightmares, and could barely leave the house without breaking down. I moved away from there a year later, but I sometimes still get scared when I'm home alone or walking around. I used to live in a studio apartment here in Denmark back in 2017. Studio apartments are basically very small, typically one-room apartments, serving as a way for young people to be able to move away from home despite not having much money. There's usually a long wait to get into these apartments. After signing up for the wait list myself, though, it wasn't long before I was approved to move in. It all happened so fast, and before I even knew it, I had a place of my own. The apartment was located in a sketchy neighborhood, mostly low-income families living off welfare, or people with special needs who'd been dropped off there by the government. That didn't really bother me, though. I had my very own place at a relatively young age, which was a huge accomplishment for me. Here, I could hang out with my friends, bring my girlfriend over whenever I wanted, and generally enjoy the feeling of being an adult. While I was living there, nothing really creepy ever happened, aside from dealing with an old lady who was mentally ill. She would always scream at other residents, cursing them. She was the kind of crazy that made you always look around you. When you pulled into the parking lot, you might want to park somewhere else if you saw she was out and about. I found out she didn't pay her electrical bill because she believed the government was monitoring her. She also always wore a bicycle helmet because she wanted to shield her brain from aliens trying to snatch it. I knew all of this from my friend who was dating a girl who worked with elderly citizens such as her. I never really felt unsafe in my apartment complex. I made sure to be aware of my surroundings, though, and always made sure to lock my doors. I did have a habit of checking my apartment before going to bed, though, on the off chance the crazy old lady was hiding somewhere, thinking I was one of the Greys. One night, after a gaming session that lasted until 3 a.m., I had just gone to bed and turned off my lights. I was very close to falling asleep when suddenly my doorbell rang. It was so loud and sudden that I almost jumped out of bed. I sat up and carefully listened to the eerie silence that followed that ringing. Mind you, this was 3 a.m., and I was not expecting any visitors. My front door had a wooden frame with slot windows at the bottom and top, which I'd covered with paper so people could not see inside. Even with the paper covering the openings, though, the hallway lights still outlined the silhouette of someone standing outside my front door. Upon seeing this, I became alarmed. I approached the door. "Excuse me, can I help you with something?" Please let me in. I need your help, please." The voice sounded drunk, but in a fake and pretend kind of way. "What do you want? Who are you?" Please help me. I need your help right now. Just let me inside." "No way, man. I don't even know who the fuck you are. Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Just let me in. I swear I'm not going to hurt you." Hearing this made everything seem much more creepy than it already was. I grabbed my golf club from behind my door. "Listen, I don't know what you need help with, but you'd better speak up or I'm coming out there and you're not gonna like what happens." "I'm looking for number 86. Please just let me in." "You're at 64, buddy. You're on the wrong level." The man then just started to bang loudly on my door. I grabbed the doorknob and prepared myself for a confrontation. Suddenly, the pounding stopped though, and I could hear the man's phone vibrating. "Hello?" "Okay." He addressed me with his voice now sounding sharp and confident. "I don't need your help anymore." He then walked back down the hallway and left. I was in full combat mode, but now I was just confused and a bit freaked out by this situation. I didn't really have any enemies that would send someone to come deal with me. Maybe this guy was at the wrong place, or perhaps it was just some psychopath messing with people at 3 o'clock in the morning. After this occurrence, I stayed up for another hour or so, smoking cigarettes and waiting to see if the man would return, but he never did. I still have no idea what that person wanted. However, the sudden shift from sounding fake drunk to perfectly sober makes me think it wasn't your typical situation. Besides, who knocks on some random person's door at 3 a.m. with all the lights off, not to mention his comment about not hurting me? I think if I had opened that door, something bad would have happened. I'm glad I decided to keep it shut. The entire ordeal had shady written all over it. I'm happy to say that nothing else like that happened again. I ended up leaving that place 2 years later. This happened when I was a university student. I wasn't a great student, to be honest. Well, not at first. I would often skip classes and just mess around with my friends. There was one girl in college who made me want to go in every now and then, though. I didn't have the guts to ask her on a date at the time that this all took place, so I had my friend and his girlfriend invite her out with us instead. It was fine because my friend and his girlfriend were mutual friends. Someone suggested that we go on a night drive. My friend and I were really into ghost hunting and stuff like that, so we would often try and find somewhere interesting to test our courage. We had heard a rumor of a place just on the outskirts of town, which was supposed to be haunted. It was this abandoned building down a dark country lane, out into the woods. It used to be a high-end lodge that people could rent out, as it had great views over the lake. That's another reason we chose to go there. Could be kind of a romantic night, right? Also, we had the chance to show the girls we were brave by exploring this abandoned lodge. Rumor had it that one of the rooms inside the lodge was covered in blood spatter, so we all went inside searching for that room, so we could take a photo to show our friends. Well, it turned out that obviously the legend was not true. It was just an abandoned building. There was the usual stuff like graffiti, broken glass, and weeds growing all over the place. Besides those things, though, there wasn't much out of the ordinary. We took a walk down close to the lake, but it had gotten far too dark at that point to make out anything really. If it had been a full moon, the view might have been a lot better. We decided to just head back to the car and drive home. I was driving that night, and my friend rode shotgun with me. The ladies were in the back. The girl who I was into sat behind me. Even though we didn't see anything spooky or even a decent view of the lake itself, we were all pretty happy with our trip out into the woods. I mean, it was still pretty fun to walk around expecting to be scared. There was tension and excitement. Plus, it was kind of a date, so all those feelings were heightened. It was a nice night overall. We all wanted to get a drink and some snacks, and someone spotted a convenience store on the way to the abandoned lodge, so we headed there next. Before we could even get off the dirt road we'd traveled down, though, I spotted something on the way to the lodge. We'd noticed a phone booth. and when we were heading back, I noticed that now there was someone standing beside it. There was a man wearing a suit. When he saw us approaching, he began to wave his hands to indicate for us to stop. My friend said something like, "I bet that guy wants us to give him a ride." I replied by telling him there wasn't enough space. I mean, the car was only a 4-seater. I didn't think the girls would want the stranger sat between them. Either way, I guess the right thing to do would be to stop and see what he needed at least. It would look pretty gentlemanly of me to do as well. Might have looked bad to the lady I liked if I didn't stop, so I pulled the car over. I already planned on telling him that I couldn't give him a ride, but I would call a taxi for him or something. The guy wandered over to us and stood with one arm on the roof of the car and one behind his back as he leaned in to speak to me through the crack I made in the window. "Hey guys, glad you stopped. Listen, I got a puncture in my tire and I don't have a phone on me. What do you say, can you give me a ride?" The guy was in his late 20s, I would say, maybe early 30s. He had an honest-looking face. You might not know what that means, but I didn't see his bike or car anywhere, but he just had a face you could trust. I was considering asking my friend to sit in the back and have this guy up front with me. I would only give him a ride as far as the convenience store. As I was mulling this over and preparing for my reply, though, the girl who I had a crush on in the back seat started going crazy, screaming and kicking my chair, then shouting at me. It totally threw me off. She shouted at me to hurry up and drive, and I did exactly as she said. I could tell she was absolutely terrified by her voice. We sped away, leaving the guy who wanted a ride looking puzzled and annoyed. I didn't slow down until she calmed down. The back of the vehicle was full of sounds of fear, hyperventilation, and confusion. We parked at the convenience store. Everyone was now a little bit calmer, so we asked our friend why she was freaking out. She said the man was holding a gun behind his back. No one goes that far out into the woods like that for no reason. I don't know and don't want to know what that guy had planned for us. I don't even know why he was out there like that in the middle of the night. What I do know is that we had a close call that night. I was so close to letting that guy in the vehicle. He almost convinced me. After that night, we stopped going to supposed haunted places at night. We found out that humans are way more frightening than ghosts anyway. I'm currently a 23-year-old woman, but this happened when I was around 10 years old. This wasn't a close encounter with a psychopath or coming face to face with a mysterious creature or something. I think what makes this encounter so creepy is the fact that it can't be explained, even to this day. When I was 10 years old, I was living with my mom and older brother. He was 12 at the time. It was in a very small bungalow. Nothing paranormal ever happened in this house before, except this one occasion. Even then, I'm not so sure it was paranormal anyway. At the time, I had one of those doorway bead curtains hanging on my bedroom door frame, so whenever someone walked in or out of my room, you would distinctly hear the beads moving around. That will be relevant later. My mom's room was right next to mine, but her door was perpendicular to mine. I could see her entire door directly from my bed. I could see very clearly whether it was opened or closed. My brother's room was in the basement at the time. Now, my mom only ever closes her door when she's sleeping inside her bedroom. If she gets up during the night to go to the washroom, her door stays open until she goes back in to sleep. One night, I fell asleep and was awoken around 3 a.m. Cliché, I know. I remember being very annoyed because I often had a very hard time going back to sleep once I woke up. It seemed like whenever I woke up, I would immediately be wide awake and have a really hard time getting any sleepiness again. I still had my earbuds in from when I was listening to music while falling asleep, so I took them out, rolled them up, and placed them on my wall-mounted shelf beside my bed. The house was dead quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator a few doors away. That and the sound of a ticking clock somewhere. I was tossing and turning for 30 seconds, trying to find a comfortable position. That was when I heard a loud bang coming from either our kitchen or living room. It sounded distinctly like a heavy item falling onto the floor. I was extremely awake now and very alert. I sat up, listening intently for another sound, hopefully sounds of walking, either from my mom or brother. Maybe my mom was in the kitchen and knocked something over. From my bed, though, I could see her bedroom door was closed, meaning she must be in her room asleep. Maybe it was my brother, but I didn't hear any sounds. No footsteps, no sound of glasses being placed on the counter, or the fridge door opening or closing. Our house was very small, so you could hear everything. I would have heard footsteps in the kitchen, and I definitely would have heard them going down the stairs. I quickly decided that something must have fallen on its own due to it being placed at a weird angle or something. I laid back down facing away from the door and attempted to go back to sleep. Not even 15 seconds later, though, I heard my door beads moving abruptly as if someone had just smacked them. Quickly, I jolted upright and looked toward my bedroom door. I was shocked to see that the beads were now completely motionless. I sat there staring at the beads that I'd just heard move. Well, what the hell was that? I decided I must be losing my mind and that I was hearing things due to adrenaline or fatigue. Once again, I laid back down to hopefully now fall asleep. This time, though, I was facing the door with my eyes wide open due to my paranoia. Like I said, I was only 10 at the time, so I was very scared at this point. My mind was racing with thoughts of monsters, ghosts, or even an intruder. Not even 30 seconds went by when I heard loud, heavy running coming from the basement. It was as if someone wearing heavy boots was running around down there. We were doing some renovations at the time, so our basement floors were really creaky and loud if you walked on them, let alone ran. I listened more closely, but by the time I'd finished getting up, the running had stopped. A few seconds later, I heard the running yet again in the basement. All I could think about was why was my brother running around in the basement at 3 a.m.? My brother has Asperger's and therefore has routines and behaves in very specific and repetitive manners. He never runs, not even during the day, let alone at 3 o'clock in the morning. I realized it couldn't be the sound of my brother. I tried not to think of the worst, a break-in. Sudden fears of my entire family being killed came to mind, but I stayed calm and listened intently for several minutes. I could clearly hear someone moving around in the basement. The creaky floorboards, like I mentioned before, made the sound very distinct. Suddenly, it all went silent. I wanted desperately to call for my mom or to run to her room, but I was so scared that I didn't dare to move or make a sound. If it was an intruder, they most likely just wanted to steal some stuff, and I didn't want to give any reason for them to come upstairs and potentially hurt my mom or me. I laid back down as quietly as possible. It took me several hours to fall back asleep, and when I woke up, the sun was shining through my window. My mom's door was open, and I heard her with my brother talking in the kitchen, along with cartoons playing in the living room. I got up quickly and went straight to the kitchen. I asked them if they too had heard anything strange last night. I expected a definitive yes, but both of them said they hadn't heard anything at all. I asked if either one of them found anything placed weirdly or found something on the kitchen or living room floor that might have fallen down in the night. They both said no. I asked if either one had gotten up in the night for any reason. Again, looking at me a little strangely, they said no. My heart dropped, so it really wasn't either one of them that caused those noises. Just to confirm, I asked my brother, why were all those noises in the basement last night? He said that he wasn't. He was confused. Neither my mom nor my brother ever sleepwalked in their lives. My brother wasn't too interested in the conversation, so he just went down to play on his computer downstairs. My mom, however, was very concerned. I told her everything that happened the night before. We checked the front door and it was firmly locked. We checked all the windows, which were closed and locked as well, perfectly undamaged. Nothing had been stolen either. I still have no idea what happened that night. No one in my family ever plays pranks like that, and I can't think of any good reason why they would either. Just to scare me and have me lose a good night's sleep? I didn't hear any sounds of anyone returning to their bedrooms at any point after the noises either. How would they have made the sound of my beads moving without ever actually moving them? If you guys have any ideas, I'd really love to hear them. I thought maybe it could have just been a very vivid and realistic nightmare or something, until I realized that my earbuds were rolled up exactly placed on my wall-mounted shelf in the same spot and position I'd placed them the night before at 3 a.m. Because of that, I don't think it's a nightmare or a night terror, but whatever it was absolutely creepy as hell to experience. I grew up in the Chicago suburb of Skokie, which is about 10 to 11 miles north of downtown Chicago. I had a pretty regular and uneventful childhood. Almost everything before the age of 11 is a blur of happy memories. I wasn't bullied in school, I never broke any bones falling off my bike. I was just kind of an ignorant and happy-go-lucky preteen boy with not so much as a care in the world. That all changed one Saturday after a visit to my Grandma Pearl's house. I remembered that I was almost at the end of 5th grade. We went to my grandma's house one Saturday to have dinner. I loved my Grandma Pearl, but my God, were trips to her place boring. My mom and dad forbade me from ever bringing along my Game Boy though, as they thought it would be quite rude. They also didn't seem to notice whenever I inevitably wandered off to try and keep myself entertained. Normally, I just wander around and explore her house, waiting until dinner was ready. This particular Saturday, though, I was feeling hungry. I went and asked my grandma how much longer dinner would be, and felt my heart sink when I heard her say not at least for another hour. I walked into the kitchen out of sight from my parents and grandma. I then peered into the little oven window to see what we were having. I think it was some type of brisket or some other kind of roast. I just remember seeing it sizzling away and wanting to speed up the process. Dumb 11-year-old me decided to crank up the heat. I wasn't so dumb that I cranked up the dial and then walked away though. I stayed put in the kitchen keeping an eye on the meat as it got browner and browner. Eventually, I started to smell a slight burning, but I thought it still smelled okay, and the meat hadn't gotten black or anything. I just went back to what I was doing, and figured I'd just check back in a few minutes. I don't know if something occupied my attention for a little too long, or if the temperature of the meat was suddenly such that it burst into flames. The next thing I remember, though, I could see black smoke pouring out of the oven. I panicked and ran into the living room and told my grandma that something was burning. She got up and followed me into the kitchen. I ran up to the oven and pointed at the black smoke and watched my grandma's expression suddenly and drastically change. I knew I was going to be in trouble if they found out I'd ruined dinner, but the way my grandma started acting really scared me. I'd never seen her look, not mad, but horrified. I didn't know what she was feeling, so I assumed the worst. I thought my sweet old grandma was about to explode on me. I can barely describe the feelings of fear and confusion I felt when she suddenly laid down on the kitchen floor and curled up into a ball. I remember her eyes grew wide, staring off at nothing, as she whispered something I couldn't hear or understand. There were only a few moments of that confusion before my parents appeared in the kitchen. My dad stepped over my grandma to deal with the burnt meat situation, while my mom kneeled next to my grandma. I had no idea what was happening. I just knew I'd somehow caused this all by burning dinner. I felt god-awful about it. Dad drove me back home and was irate with me, and I was pretty angry at myself too. All I wanted was to eat dinner a little sooner, and now I'd be lucky if I got a PB&J after being banished to my room for giving my grandma a heart attack. That's honestly what I thought it was at first. Even when my dad said it wasn't a heart attack, I still had this terrible feeling that something equally awful had happened, something that was all my fault. My dad stayed home after I went up to my room and laid under my covers just crying. My mom stayed with my grandma to make sure she was okay. She returned home later that night, by which point it was way past my bedtime. Even so, they woke me up to sit me on my bed and have a little talk with me. I won't tell you everything they said to me, or this would take hours to write up. Long story short, my grandma had lived through World War II. My parents gave me a full history lesson right there in bed and explained why the smell of burning meat had upset my grandma so much. I remember being gripped with horror the entire way through. I couldn't believe that people could be so evil to each other over something so small. It killed me to think my own selfishness had brought back such horrific memories for my grandma. I guess my mom and dad thought the best thing to do was just be honest with me, having realized my fear of the unknown would hurt worse than the dark truth. I suppose in hindsight it was the best thing to do, but it messed with my head so bad I could barely sleep a wink that night. I called my grandma the next day to apologize for scaring her and told her that my parents had explained all she'd been through. Obviously, she had not wanted me to know. I guess my mom and dad were complicit in shielding me from that ugly truth. I suppose it's like a lot of things with kids. You want to keep them as innocent as possible until absolutely necessary. Then just hope they're equipped to deal with the truth. I didn't even know I was Jewish, or at least had Jewish ancestry. My mom didn't practice her religion, and her parents didn't mind if she married someone who didn't either. It wasn't like she was ashamed of her heritage or anything. She just learned that a lot of Jewish holidays brought back bad memories for my grandma. This story takes place during Thanksgiving break, when I was just starting middle school. My old elementary school had a termite problem, and the school board decided to move operations to the local YMCA. They were told that the infestation was more severe than they'd thought, and it would take about 1.5 years to deal with it. While the school was being renovated, my brother Jack and I decided to go check things out. The school never really had any rumors about being haunted or anything like that, so we weren't exactly expecting anything spooky to happen. We walked around looking at all the demolished walls and piles of old wood and glass. We weren't the only ones who had this bright idea, though. We saw some very inappropriate content, either drawn or written on some of the classroom chalkboards. Jack and I had just about had our fill of this place and decided to check out just one more classroom before leaving. The chalkboard in that room had a message written on it. Look under the sink. My brother, being the stupid person he is, went over to the sink and opened up the cabinet beneath it. There was nothing there, but as soon as he stood up, we heard a loud crash. We both looked to the far end of the classroom, where there was a man in a white phantom mask. I recognized that mask from the plays my school did, Phantom of the Opera. The man proceeded to walk along the row of classroom windows and shattered each one of them with a crowbar. Jack and I rushed out of the room and down the long hallway toward the exit. While we were running, I remember hearing footsteps behind us. I also remember hearing someone yelling too, but it could have just been my mind playing tricks on me due to the heightened state of panic. When we got back to our house, we didn't say a word about this to anyone. We didn't want to get in trouble for being at the school when the school was closed down. When the school finally became operational again, we didn't hear anything about the shadowed windows or a masked man with a crowbar. Seeing how we clearly weren't the only ones to trespass, I imagine there were quite a few instances of vandalism that the construction crew had to deal with. I know that kids, especially at that age, can have wild imaginations, but encountering real danger is something you'll never forget. I don't know if the Phantom was just trying to scare us, or if they wanted to bash our little heads in, but my brother and I sure weren't sticking around to find out. I've always believed I possessed a sixth sense, the ability to detect the presence of the deceased. I've witnessed inexplicable occurrences, and you can trust me on that. I've found myself at times hearing voices or catching shadow people out of the corner of my eye. In some instances, the doors to rooms would suddenly swing open. When that happens, especially when you're home alone, it can be incredibly eerie. However, all those eerie and spooky paranormal encounters I've witnessed pale in comparison to this one particular experience. It took place about 3 years ago now. It happened shortly after I moved into a new apartment. The movers had just delivered all my belongings and furniture. Given the long day that I'd had, I decided not to unpack much that night, focusing only on the essentials. I got ready for bed quite early. Moving into a new place always gives me a peculiar sense of excitement. Seeing the initial room somewhat bare allows you to imagine many possibilities for your space. I laid in bed on the brink of drifting into sleep, having thoughts of what to unpack the next morning occupying my mind, when I heard something rather strange. I must have been on the verge of falling asleep when it happened, but I distinctly began to hear laughter, sounds emanating from the other side of the wall, possibly from the living room. I found that indeed quite strange. I only heard the laughter one time that night, so I drifted off to sleep without thinking much of it. Upon waking the next morning, though, I was taken aback to hear the same laughter again. I was having my breakfast at the time. My immediate thought was that one of my neighbors must have had quite an unusual and creepy-sounding laugh. Strangely enough, I couldn't discern what they were laughing about, nor could I hear a TV or any other sound, really. It struck me that maybe they were wearing headphones or something, which could explain how loud the laughter was. Laughing with headphones on often leads to a lack of one's own volume. Feeling curious and thinking this might be a good opportunity to introduce myself to my neighbors, I decided to give it a shot. It seemed like they were awake and at home. I stepped outside and buzzed on their door. Despite buzzing the door a couple of times, I received no response. The lack of response somewhat validated my theory that they must be wearing headphones. As I turned to leave, I noticed another person exiting the apartment down the hallway. As luck would have it, this neighbor's apartment was much further down the hall. He approached me and casually mentioned, no one has lived there for quite a long time. That revelation took me by surprise. I didn't divulge the details of the strange laughter I'd heard the previous night and that morning. Instead, I thanked the neighbor for the information and headed back inside my apartment. My perceptions may have been influenced by my supposed supernatural senses, because I thought that some sort of spirit might be attempting to unnerve me or something. I wasn't going to let that drive me away from my apartment, though. I was determined to stay put. Hearing laughter occasionally wasn't the worst thing. One could ignore that. There were certainly scarier things in the world. As the months passed, I continued to intermittently hear the neighboring man's laughter. The sound seemed to originate from the other side of my living room wall. After this period, a new sound began accompanying the laughter as well. It happened every time the laughter did, a sort of cracking noise that really grated on my nerves. I considered the possibility of some rat or other creature gnawing at the wall. The idea of relocating did cross my mind, but I quickly dispelled that thought. I just attempted to ignore the noises to the best of my ability. One night, though, when I was already in quite a bad mood, I heard the laughter and other noise again. My frustration got the better of me, and I impulsively kicked the section of the wall that was the source of the sounds. Almost immediately, I realized how futile and silly my action was. If I was dealing with something paranormal, that wouldn't do anything. To my surprise, something unexpected occurred. I heard a distinct voice react to my kick, a male voice that seemed to come from within the wall itself. I also heard what sounded like a crumbling from within that area. In a matter of moments, all thoughts of paranormal vanished from my mind. I hadn't considered the simplest explanation, that someone might have illicitly entered the adjacent apartment and been living there this whole time. This realization really struck me. I wasted no time and called the police. Law enforcement officers arrived at the building with impressive speed. They attempted to enter the neighboring apartment. That's when a male voice erupted, shouting at the officers. It became clear there was indeed someone inside. I learned later that a middle-aged man had secretly been residing there. He was high on substances when the police confronted him. To my astonishment, it turned out he was the son of the apartment manager, and his father was aware of his actions. The father had been hiding his son's presence from the authorities. Discovering that a stranger had been living next door was undoubtedly distressing. It wasn't the most unsettling aspect of the ordeal, though. While the man's laughter had always given me chills, the sound that truly haunted me was the scratching noise. This scratching noise, I discovered, was caused by a kitchen knife scraping against the wall. The damage to the wall was so extensive that the man had nearly carved a hole through it into my apartment. I couldn't definitively ascertain his intentions, but I couldn't rule out the possibility that he intended to gain access to my unit. The police informed me that he knew my name somehow, yet I had no knowledge of him whatsoever. Something was gravely amiss, and my unease grew. Feeling unsafe, I made the decision to move as soon as feasible. In the aftermath of this unnerving episode, I realized the scariest entity to me is not of the supernatural variety, but another human being. Nothing can compare to the lingering memory of that man next door. There are nights when I wake up wondering if I'll still hear the sound of his knife scraping against the wall as he laughs. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.